Welcome back to Saturnday, ladies and gentlemen, the show where we take a look at a Sega Saturn game from years back, share some memories, show some gameplay, give some background info, and give you my opinion on whether or not the game holds up today. Today we're going to be taking a look at a somewhat obscure Japanese Saturn game, Linkle Liver Story, or as all the Western magazines of the time called it, Wrinkle River Story. Which seems much more realistic if I'm being honest. It's very common for translational issues to pop up from Japanese to English, especially in terms of words with L's and R's. So let's stick with Wrinkle River Story, if that's okay with all of you, even though the title screen clearly says Linkle Liver Story, but I digress. This Japanese exclusive was released on March 15th, 1996, and the translation you're seeing here was done by Aishsha. At least, I think that's how the name is pronounced, which makes the game fully playable in English for the very first time. Although, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Japanese original wasn't too hard to play, except for obviously story elements and locational clues. Thanks to Aishsha, we can now experience this beauty in our native language. Well, English speakers at least. I will put the translated instruction manual and the patch links in the description below, but a huge thank you has to be given to Aishsha because this is just amazing. Wrinkle River Story was developed by the fine folks at Nextech and published by Sega itself. Many consider it to be the spiritual successor to the incredibly rare Sega Genesis game Crusader of Senti. For those unaware, Crusader of Senti is a Zelda-like action RPG that was released by Atlas in North America for the Sega Genesis back in March 1995, and was only available in a very limited run and therefore is extremely rare today, frequently fetching nearly $1,000 when it pops up on eBay, which doesn't happen very often at all. While Wrinkle River Story isn't a direct sequel, it certainly shares a lot in common with Crusader of Senti in terms of gameplay, and of course the fact that it was developed by Nextech. Perhaps one day I'll review Crusader of Senti, as it's actually a fun game, and it actually plays a little bit better than Wrinkle River Story. Alright, so let's jump on into the main event. The game begins with a cinematic displaying a planet called Mamuna, which for the longest time had no life on it. Then one day, almost miraculously, a lone flower blossomed under the sea, from which all life sprang forth. Eventually, as time passed, the legend of the flower grew, and its place of origin became known as Totem. Evil forces would stop at nothing to get their hands on this legendary relic. Many moons ago, an ancient evil managed to subdue the planet, and all beast folk had to come together to stop this great evil. Now, many centuries have passed, and a new beast folk chief has been working for many months training a new disciple named Kit. Will that ancient evil ever return, or will peace be everlasting? Well, because of the fact that the game just started, I think you know the answer to that question. While you may not know very much at first, the story slowly starts to unfold as you hit about the 2-hour mark, and it gets surprisingly interesting and deep the further you go. The various characters you meet along the way all have great personalities, and you'll befriend them in no time because they seem to really care about you on this journey. Your main partner is a tree folk spore named Kuchimuku. This bad boy has the ability to stun enemies if you charge his attack, done by holding the B button, I might add. And speaking of controls and gameplay, they're pretty much what you would expect from an action RPG. You move around in 8 directions, attacking enemies, collecting water orbs, or pearls as they're called here, dashing, solving simple puzzles, and taking out large dungeon bosses. Before going any further, I do have to mention one element that does take some getting used to, and that is the weapon speed and range. While there are 7 different weapon types in the game, including a staff, sword, boomerang, hammer, axe, spear, and glove, their range and speed really do take a serious amount of time to get used to. I never found they handled precisely as I wanted, and as such I was constantly walking into enemies because the weapons take about a second or two too long to animate. You do get used to it by the time you finish the first or second dungeon, but had weapons been just a fraction faster, I think it would have made a world of difference. As such, I stuck with swords for the vast majority of my playthrough simply because I'd gotten used to their range and speed. And speaking of range and speed, each weapon has 3 basic statistics: range, speed, and power. So even if you play around with all the different types, I just never found one that really connected well with me. Speaking of weapons, Wrinkle River Story has a very, very unique way of acquiring weapons, and it's tied into the exploration and combat system. For starters, as you explore, you'll come across a variety of seeds: water, fire, earth, and wind. Later in the game, you'll also find dark and light seeds, but those are really special. As you find more of the same type of seed, they essentially level up the weapon, with the max being level 4. Finding them is critical to making new weapons, which is done at these flower circles in the Land of 4 Seasons. This is extremely unique, and the system determines the weapon you receive based on where you plant the seed. So for example, if you plant the seed in the dead center of the circles or the Venn diagram, you'll get a staff. Whereas if you plant the seed at the bottom far right-hand corner, you'll acquire a boomerang. Learning this system is crucial if you want to get the weapon that you enjoy using. Locating seeds is also important because you want to quickly gain access to level 4 items because they're so much more powerful than what you start with. I mentioned the water orbs earlier, and they're used to water the seeds so that you can make as many weapons as you like, since seeds don't disappear. And you'll use up all of your water orbs if you just go around willy-nilly planting seeds everywhere. What's nice is that you can grind water orbs from enemies, so you can technically make as many weapons as you want. But what I love about this is that they're all tied together, so the water is acquired from enemies, whereas the seeds are acquired through exploration. So you're really encouraged to battle enemies and to explore. And there's a further wrinkle, get it, see what I did there, to the weapon creation system. Each of the 4 seasons are slowly unlocked as you progress. So let's say you unlock the summer region and you plant an earth seed there, you will not only benefit from the earth elemental weapon at whatever level you planted, but your magical attacks as well as Puchimuku's abilities will be determined based on the season where the seed was planted. I know that might sound ultra confusing, but once you actually get your hands on the game and you start using the system, it makes a lot of sense and it works exceptionally well. So ultimately, there are 7 weapons possible with 4 elemental attributes as well as 4 seasonal magical abilities. What that means is there are 112 different combinations for you to play around with. Add in the 2 other seeds, light and dark, that I mentioned earlier, which only have 1 level, and the total rises even higher. I know it's a bit confusing to explain here when you're not actually playing the game, but once you learn the ins and outs of the elemental system, you can absolutely decimate enemies by constantly switching to a weapon that is of their counter attribute. So yeah, there's even strategy mixed in for good measure. Earlier I said you could perform a dash, and I thought it was odd how the game implemented this. You have to press the C button twice, and the C button is the jump button. Yeah, that's right, you have to press the jump button twice in order to perform a dash. Meanwhile, the X and Y buttons are not used at all. Why didn't the developer just map the dash button to one of those buttons is beyond me. The L and R buttons are used to alternate between the up to 4 weapons you can have, 1 per season. And the other oddity is that there's no button map for talking to other characters. Instead you just run into them and they start chatting. It's not the end of the world, but it does feel a little bit odd when you have buttons on the controller not being used, and it's also a little bit annoying sometimes where you'll constantly be running into folks and they start talking to you when you never wanted to actually speak to them. In terms of a challenge, don't expect too much of a hard time with this game. It seems to have been designed for younger players. Bosses can easily be finished your first time tackling them, and weirdly enough, they get easier as the game progresses, with some bosses literally just standing there waiting for you to just mash on the attack button and destroy them. That doesn't mean you won't die, because you likely will until you get used to what I was saying earlier about weapon speed and range, so enemies are going to constantly be walking into you. That only seems to affect the earlier portions of the game. Later on you'll get the hang of it, and then you'll be able to just wreck face for everybody. I'd say in total the game's about 7 to 9 hours for those who keep track of that sort of thing. In terms of the audio-visual presentation, well, you can see for yourself, it looks great. I really love the design of the game. It features great 2D sprites mixed with some polygonal elements every now and then. There's great use of color, great animation, and overall the whole game just has this really nice charm to it. This is certainly a game that wasn't possible on the Sega Genesis, and really does feel like a natural evolution to what we saw with Crusader of Senti. While I would have preferred a few more frames of animation for the attacking animation, as what's here now is the same regardless of whatever weapon you're using. The music is utterly fantastic, and the sound effects for the most part are good, except for a couple that are kind of weird, like when you jump in water, the sound effect really doesn't match what it should. And there's a couple of other oddities here and there. But overall, the audio-visual presentation is really top-notch, and this is another one to show people who love 2D games how they were evolved in the 32-bit era in terms of audio-visual presentation. Now, before we wrap up this look at Wrinkle River Story, I have to talk about some of my memories attached to it. As most of you likely know, I'm a huge Zelda fan, always have been. For years, I've been on the hunt for another game or series that played similarly to Zelda, but that really retained that same sort of quality. And as such, I've been introduced to a wealth of games across multiple systems. I originally heard about this one through a friend of mine who said, "Hey, you like Zelda? You might like this." I remember placing an order over the phone and having to wait ages for it to arrive. This was one of those games where I had it redirected to my local game store, and I just felt like I was waiting and waiting and waiting. And when the game finally arrived, which honestly it probably was like 2 months after I ordered it, maybe even longer, I remember being immediately taken back by the charm. And I also remember being confused out of my mind how to get new weapons, because it wasn't quite as easy to understand when it was in Japanese. Ultimately though, I found the game to be well worth the wait, and thanks to this new English translation patch, it's sort of like I experienced the game for the first time, and I think you guys are going to love it. You'll be very happy to hear that you won't have to sell your left lung in order to purchase this one, as it's actually only about $25 on eBay at the time of this recording, and if you do a buy it now, you can get it for about $30 to $35. However, be warned, given that the patch is available now, and the fact that, I'm doing a video on it and others most likely will do the same, I'm pretty sure more and more people are going to start to buy the game, so those prices are likely going to rise, so act fast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Saturnday, and we'll be back shortly with another, just for you.